Hey, I want to talk about ethics because the first time I heard about Buddhist ethics, I thought, like, what's the point? Like, don't you get enlightened and then you transcend ethics, right? Like, isn't that kind of the whole point? You're not just trying to learn some like category of how to behave, but you're actually like learning to flow with the Tao and like, you know, supposedly you get there and you can do no wrong, right? Well, yeah. So meanwhile, we have all kinds of serious ethical issues in spiritual circles and um, even abuse. So I just wanted to talk about that a little bit, that whole conundrum. Um, so yeah, the problem here is the first problem is the human ego can co-opt anything, and enlightenment is actually one of the juiciest things that the ego can co-opt. It's like somebody might get sort of enlightened or think they're sort of enlightened, and then reify that into believing their identity is an enlightened identity. And then they might say like, oh well, I even if I'm doing something that might be considered abuse by other people, it's not really abuse because I'm enlightened. I'm good. I'm flowing with the Tao. You can fool yourself. So that's one issue. Um, Another issue is that most of us aren't going to get there in this lifetime. Uh, I mean, not perfectly, right? It's as Angelo says, it's asymptotic. So hopefully you kind of get closer and closer and closer to, like, you don't even call it perfected. I don't know. Like, point is, most of us aren't going to get there anytime soon, and maybe never. So in the meantime, it's kind of like you need something to work with, right? Um, and my hunch is that by definition, the more awake you are, the more ethical you are in a universal sense. Um, but ethical in a universal sense is probably like 84 dimensional chess to a human mind. Um, and Yeah, like I said, we're just not going to get there anytime soon. So, so any ethical framework, like, in physics, when you have a theory that's worked for a long time and someone says, oh, I have a better theory, it has to reduce to the old theory. By which I mean, if the old theory had like a simple formula that describes certain things on certain scales, the new theory has to describe them at least as well, basically reducing to the old theory on those scales. So, like, example, Einstein's special relativity easily reduces to Newton's laws when the speed is slow relative to the speed of light, which is true in our everyday life. So that's why Newton's laws worked so well for so long, right? And if it didn't, the theory would be in a lot of trouble, right? So similarly, like, whatever enlightened ethics are, one would hope that to some extent we can reduce them to what we instinctively think of as morals in our everyday life. And probably eventually that collapses into the same thing anyway. But anyway, um, I'll get to that in a minute. But what we consider ethics in our everyday life, like the ways philosophers and different people kind of argue about it, it's more intuitive than logical. We might try to use logic to get to our intuitive ethics, but the intuition comes first. Um, Otherwise, we have nothing to compare our logic to, right? Because like the Nazis can say they decided it was logical to mass murder people they didn't want, but intuitively, especially if you zoom in on the actual people affected, it's pretty clear that's monstrous. I mean, pretty clear to anyone. Um, and there was a study, and this is in sort of it's in my book in the last chapter, but there was a study that told Jewish Israeli children a story about a Chinese general committing genocidal acts, and like 75% of the kids was like, oh, that's wrong, of course that's wrong, when they were given a choice. But they showed a different set of Jewish Israeli kids Old Testament stories of genocide, like basically the same thing but told through their stories. And 60% said, oh yes, that's right, that's correct. Interestingly, the 60%, and hope like hearteningly, that 60% is quite a bit less than the 75% who thought it was wrong when the Chinese general did it. Um, Only 60% of Jewish Israeli children said that was right. So, I mean, even these children, that like 40% of them or whatever, had a pretty good sense that, like, yeah, maybe that's a story. Maybe that happened in the past, but it's not something that you want to happen today, right? Um, but many of us, whoever we are, whatever our tradition, can be brainwashed in the direction of you know of monstrous acts. None of us are immune from that. Um, we can be fooled by our stories. Our ego can like believe that we can abuse people because we have that right, because it's something special about us, or because we're more enlightened, or whatever. I mean, unfortunately, people in the West often use things like women's rights as a bludgeon to justify like unprovoked wars and that kind of thing. So, yeah. And these ethics, these basic ethics of like, yeah, it's not necessarily conservative, liberal, or progressive per se. Like human ethics, I mean, you can be conservative about something and still ethical. You can be liberal about something and still ethical. Progressive, you can be progressive and unethical too. You definitely see that. I mean, progressive, they think of themselves as the most enlightened, the most evolved people, and that can lead to them, sort of engaging in the same behaviors um, they protest against. Yeah. So, but if you get to a point, for example, where you're justifying the deliberate starvation of children, I would strongly encourage you to take a serious look at your belief structure and where it might be a little bit weaker than, yeah, where the chinks might be that got you to that point. Yeah. So where does this basic intuition of ethics come from? I would argue, I mean, my current hypothesis is that it comes from our deep understanding that we're all one and we all know how we want to be treated and why should it be different for anyone else. And it's, you look at our long and bloody history, it's kind of amazing that intuition has survived through so many centuries of tribal and international warfare and endless identity-based brainwashing. But you ask kids basic moral questions, and most of them can get at what most of us consider. Well, I can't even say that. Like, people don't always, yeah, think like that, but most people do. I would argue. Like, I've been all around the world. I've interacted with people from many countries, dozens of countries. People are generally kind. People generally treated me very kindly, even when I was absolutely nobody. And it really increased my, my faith in human nature more than I expected it to. But none of us are immune from making mistakes. And anytime we start to get a big head about being enlightened, it can be a bad scene. So it is nice to have a framework, even if it's relatively rudimentary compared to 84-dimensional chess or whatever. So it's not just a free-for-all. Maybe if you're really, like, truly enlightened, maybe if you're the Buddha, it really is a free-for-all. And, like, sometimes something we might consider intolerant or cruel is called for by the universe. I don't know. But I think most of the people doing what most of us consider unethical or abusive things, it's because they aren't as enlightened as they think they are. And it's very easy to fall into that trap, especially when we have shadow of like abandonment or a lack of validation or whatever that we haven't brought to light, that it's too painful to bring it to light. You can end up burying that even more deeply, exiling that even more profoundly, and the rebound from that deep shadow can be really, really unpleasant. So it's good to stay humble, to find and follow some reasonable ethical precepts, at least for when all else fails, or within communities. And it's like, okay, who gets to decide what the guidelines are? It's not always straightforward, but try to default to kindness as best you can, even if you might not always perfectly hit the mark. And definitely recognize your own reactivity, because often it might be trying to show you something that you really don't want to look at, but maybe you really should.